The bells of St. Michael's Church tolled solemnly, calling the faithful to Mass. The congregation filled the pews, their chatter silenced by the commanding presence of Father Nonso as he ascended the pulpit. His robe shimmered in the filtered sunlight, casting him as a beacon of hope and righteousness. His voice resonated through the hallowed halls, delivering a fiery sermon about redemption, humility, and the eternal battle between good and evil. His flock hung on his every word, captivated by the man they believed was their shepherd, their guide in a turbulent world. Yet beneath the holy exterior lay a web of lies. Nonso's dual life was a dangerous balancing act. While his days were spent as a respected priest, his nights belonged to a criminal gang he led with an iron fist. That evening, Nonso shed his cassock and donned a black mask, his transformation complete. His gang was gathered in an abandoned warehouse, waiting for his command. Their target was Senator Okafor, a corrupt politician notorious for embezzling public funds. The senator was moving millions in cash, and Nonso's meticulous planning had ensured a flawless ambush. The convoy rolled onto a deserted road where the gang waited in the shadows. Within moments, chaos erupted. Armed men surrounded the vehicles, overpowering the senator's security detail with precision. Nonso orchestrated the operation with military efficiency, barking orders through a radio. Just as the team loaded the cash into their getaway vehicle, a new threat emerged, headlights in the distance. A police patrol had stumbled onto the scene. Panic spread through the gang like wildfire. "Stay calm!" Nonso hissed, removing his mask. He grabbed a rosary from his pocket and approached the officers, his hands trembling convincingly. "I'm Father Nonso," he cried. "These men abducted me. Please help!" The officers were visibly taken aback. Seeing the rosary and the priestly demeanor, they believed him. They offered Nonso a ride back to safety while the gang escaped into the night. By dawn, Nonso was back in the pulpit, delivering a serene morning homily about the importance of trust in God's plan. His congregation sat in awe, never suspecting their beloved priest had spent the night leading a high-stakes heist. After the service, Bishop Emeka approached him with news that turned Nonso's blood cold. "Father Nonso, St. Michael's has been chosen to lead the annual pilgrimage to Ukwoma," the bishop said with a warm smile. Nonso's mask of calm almost slipped. Ukwoma was a place of nightmares, a town where his gang's bloodiest heist had left a permanent scar. "It will be an honor," Nonso replied, his voice steady, but inside, dread clawed at his chest. The days leading up to the pilgrimage were fraught with unease. For Father Nonso, each moment felt like a clock ticking toward disaster. Ukwoma was no ordinary destination for him. It was the site of a heist that had defined his gang's brutality. 5 years earlier, the anointed marauders had stormed the town, robbing its largest microfinance bank and leaving behind a trail of death and despair. The memories of that night haunted him. He could still hear the screams of the victims and the gunshots that shattered the silence. Nonso had ordered no unnecessary violence, but when the operation spiraled out of control, it had been his decision to push forward, sacrificing lives to secure their escape. He had buried that chapter deep, but now it threatened to resurface. In the back room of a shabby bar on the outskirts of Lagos, Nonso met with Jaid, his right-hand man and the gang's enforcer. Jaid leaned back in his chair, his scarred face lit dimly by a flickering bulb. "We can't go through with this pilgrimage," Jaid said, his voice gruff but firm. "Ukwoma isn't safe for you, for us." Nonso, sipping his drink, shook his head. Cancelling would raise suspicion. The bishop would ask questions we can't afford to answer. "So what's the plan, boss?" Jaid asked, his tone sharp. "Pretend you're a saint and hope nobody recognizes you?" "I've spent years building this image," Nonso replied. "If I show weakness now, it all crumbles. Besides, not everyone remembers a face from a robbery. Time has a way of dulling memories." Jaid wasn't convinced. "And if someone does remember, then we deal with it," Nonso said, his voice icy. quietly. Gide's expression darkened. You'd better hope it doesn't come to that. The dawn of the pilgrimage was met with hymns and prayers. The congregation, dressed in their finest attire, gathered around the church's buses. For most of them, the journey to Ukwoma was a spiritual retreat, a chance to connect with God and seek blessings. For Father Nonso, it was a journey into the lion's den. Nonso stood at the church gate, offering blessings to the pilgrims as they boarded the buses. His heart raced as he spotted Deaconess Ifeoma. Her sharp eyes seemed to pierce through him, and her smile carried an undertone of suspicion. "Father, you look tense," she said casually as she climbed aboard. "Just concerned for everyone's safety," Nonso replied, forcing a smile. As the buses roared to life, the congregation began singing hymns. The voices of the faithful filled the air, momentarily easing Nonso's anxiety. But the further they got from Lagos, the heavier the burden on his chest became. But the worst was yet to come. Ahead lay Ukwoma, a town where ghosts of his past waited to confront him. The convoy rode into Ukwoma as the late afternoon sun cast long shadows over the small town. The air seemed to thicken with tension as the pilgrims disembarked, their spirits high despite the long journey. For Father Nonso, every step on the dusty road felt like walking a tightrope over a pit of memories. The town square had changed little since his last visit 5 years ago. The crumbling buildings, the faded market stalls, and the quiet despair etched into the faces of the locals. It was all too familiar. Ukwoma still bore the scars of the heist, and Nonso couldn't help but notice the wary glances the townspeople cast at the newcomers. As the pilgrims gathered for the official welcome ceremony, Nonso's unease grew. Standing before the crowd, he delivered a speech laced with gratitude and humility, his voice steady despite the storm raging within him. "We are honored to be here," he said, his hands clasped in a gesture of prayer. "This town has shown resilience and faith through trials, and we are here to share in your strength." Among the townsfolk stood Mama Nkechi, a widow whose life had been upended by the robbery. She had lost her husband that fateful night, and the grief had aged her beyond her years. As Nonso spoke, her eyes widened. Something about his voice stirred a memory long buried but never forgotten. After the ceremony, the pilgrims were shown to their accommodations. Mama Nkechi lingered, her mind racing. She couldn't shake the feeling that she had heard that voice before, on the night her husband was killed. Later that evening, the pilgrims gathered in the town's church for a prayer session. As Nonso led the service, Mama Nkechi sat in the back, her gaze fixed on him. Suddenly, she rose to her feet. "You!" she shouted, her voice trembling with anger and pain. "I know you. You were there the night my husband was murdered." The congregation fell silent, the weight of her words hanging heavy in the air. Nonso froze, his mind scrambling for a response. "My sister," he said, his tone gentle yet firm, "I do not know what pain you carry, but I assure you, I am a man of God. Perhaps my voice reminds you of someone else." "My sister," he said, his tone gentle yet firm, "I do not know what pain you carry, but I assure you, I am a man of God. Perhaps my voice reminds you of someone else." The congregation murmured, unsure of what to believe. Nonso's calm demeanor and years of service gave his words weight, but Mama Nkechi's grief and conviction were undeniable. As the tension dissipated, Nonso felt relief wash over him, but he knew this was only the beginning. Mama Nkechi's piercing glare followed him as he left the church, a silent promise that she would not let this go. For the first time in years, Nonso felt his carefully constructed facade begin to crack. The morning after Mama Nkechi's public accusation, the town was abuzz with whispers. Though Nonso had skillfully deflected her claims, doubts had taken root among both his congregation and the townspeople. Deaconess Ifeoma, ever perceptive, decided to investigate further. She approached Mama Nkechi in the marketplace, where the widow was selling fresh vegetables. "Tell me more about what you saw," Ifeoma said, her voice low. Mama Nkechi hesitated. "I can't be certain," she admitted, her hands trembling as she adjusted her wares. But his voice, it was him. "I'm sure of it." Ifeoma nodded thoughtfully. "We need proof. Keep watching him. If you notice anything, let me know." The sun had barely risen when Nonso was summoned to the rectory. Bishop Emeka had arrived in Ukwoma unexpectedly, his stern demeanor sending ripples of unease through the parish. Nonso approached the rectory with trepidation, his mind racing to anticipate what the bishop might know. Inside, Bishop Emeka sat at the head of the table, flanked by 2 senior priests. His piercing gaze met Nonso's as he motioned for him to sit. "Father Nonso," the bishop began, his voice calm but authoritative. "Troubling news has reached my ears. I understand you've been accused of unspeakable things by a widow in this town. Is there truth to her claims?" Nonso kept his face neutral, though his heart pounded. "Your Grace, I assure you, there is no truth to these accusations. This woman is grieving, and her pain has clouded her judgment. My conscience is clear." The bishop studied him for a moment before leaning forward. "The church cannot afford a scandal. If there is even a shadow of doubt about your past, you must come clean now. Confession is the first step toward redemption." "I have nothing to confess," Nonso replied, his tone resolute. The bishop sighed deeply, as if burdened by the weight of his next words. "Very well. To restore faith in this parish and resolve this matter, I will hold a public reconciliation ceremony. Mama Nkechi will be given the chance to air her grievance, and you will have the opportunity to defend yourself before God and the community." Nonso's stomach churned. A public confrontation was the last thing he needed. "Your Grace, I fear this will only fuel further discord," he said carefully. "It is not a request, Father Nonso," the bishop said, his tone leaving no room for argument. "The ceremony will take place in 3 days." Back in his quarters, Nonso paced furiously. He had always been in control, but now the tides were shifting. The bishop's involvement threatened to unravel everything. He convened a meeting with Jide that night. "We need to act fast," Nonso said. "The ceremony is a trap." "Let me take out that woman," Jide growled. "No!" Nonso snapped. "Violence will only bring more scrutiny. We need a more subtle approach." Nonso spent the night devising a plan. He would plant false evidence to discredit Mama Nkechi and prove his innocence. But deep down, he knew the walls were closing in, and his time was running out. As dawn broke, Nonso knelt before the altar, his prayers laced with desperation. For the first time, he wondered if even God could save him. The 3 days leading to the reconciliation ceremony were a whirlwind of anxiety and preparation. Nonso worked tirelessly to fabricate evidence that would exonerate him. He arranged for a known petty thief from a neighboring town to confess to the Ukwoma robbery in exchange for a large sum of money. With false testimonies and planted evidence, Nonso hoped to shift suspicion away from himself. But Jide had never been one to follow orders blindly. That evening, he took matters into his own hands. Disguised as a local laborer, he ambushed Mama Nkechi outside her modest home. She fought back fiercely, her screams alerting neighbors who rushed to her aid. Jade fled into the shadows, leaving her bloodied but alive. When news of the attack spread, the community was outraged. Mama Nkechi, though shaken, pointed a trembling finger in Nonso's direction. "This is his doing," she cried to the police. "He sent someone to silence me." Police officers arrived at the church to question Nonso. "This is a grave misunderstanding," he said, his tone dripping with concern. "Mama Nkechi has endured unimaginable trauma. Her accusations stem from pain, not truth. As for the attack on her, I assure you, neither I nor anyone in my parish would ever condone such violence." The officer seemed skeptical, but left without making an arrest. Nonso knew this was a temporary reprieve. Later that evening, word came that Jaid had been arrested. The police, acting on eyewitness accounts, had tracked him down. His capture threatened to expose the entire gang. A policeman interrogated Jaid. Inspector cleared his throat. "So, tell me again," he said, pressing the record button. "You and Father Nonso rob houses together. A man of God." Jaid chuckled, his gold tooth glinting under the fluorescent light. "Man of God." He leaned back, shaking his head. "Oga police, don't be deceived. That man is more dangerous than me." The policeman arched an eyebrow. "Explain." Jaid exhaled, rubbing his hands together. "See, I used to rob houses alone, small jobs. Then I met Father Nonso. He came to me, said he had divine inspiration, said God told him to find a way to help his congregation." The officer frowned. "Help them by stealing?" Jaid nodded, smirking. "Exactly." He knew who to target. Rich church members, corrupt politicians, businessmen who donated to his church but lived in sin. He'd find out their secrets in confession. Then I'd do the dirty work. The officer felt a chill run down his spine. "And the people never suspected." Jaida grinned. "They trusted him. They came every Sunday, shouting, 'Amen,' while we spent their stolen money on land, cars, even charity. Nonso called it redistribution. He'd give to widows, struggling church members, orphans. He even built a school." He leaned in, voice lower. Man was a genius. No one suspects a pastor. It was a Sunday morning when Nonso was finally captured. He stood in the pulpit, delivering a sermon to his flock, his voice rising and falling in the usual cadence. But the peace was shattered when police officers burst into the church, their weapons drawn. The congregation gasped in shock as Nonso was handcuffed before them. "Father Nonso," the officer said, his voice cold, "you're under arrest for your involvement in a series of armed robberies, including the infamous Ukwoma heist." The church fell silent, and Nonso's heart sank. For the first time in years, he stood exposed, his sacred mass shattered in front of everyone. The man they had trusted, the pillar of their community, was nothing more than a criminal. As they led him out of the church, Mama Nkechi stepped forward. Her face was calm but filled with quiet triumph. "Justice has come, Father," she said softly. "You may have hidden behind God's robes for years, but today you will answer for your sins." Sentenced to life in prison, Nonso found himself behind bars, stripped of everything he had once held dear. The mask was gone, but the scars of his past would haunt him forever. As the final door slammed shut behind him, Nonso realized that he was no longer just the priest of St. Michael's. He was something far darker. But in the quiet solitude of his cell, he finally faced the truth. He had been his own worst enemy all along. The end of the journey was a bitter one for Nonso, but it was a necessary reckoning. A man who had lived by lies would die by them, and the world would move on. But for Nonso, his path was now a memory, a cautionary tale of power, deception, and the fragile nature of the human soul.